Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to our Black Graduate Research Slam. Today we'll be talking with three amazing Black grad students who I would like them to introduce themselves in no particular order, but the order of my Zoom shows Jamaal first. So Jamaal, tell us who you are, pronouns, what you study, all the things.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alyssa. And hello, everyone. My name is Jamaal Muwwakkil. I use he, him pronouns. And I am a fifth year PhD candidate in the Department of Linguistics here at UC Santa Barbara. My research usually hits higher education alongside Black language and culture with a little bit of political discourse. So fun all around.
Thank you. How about Melanie?
Hi, I'm Melanie, a third year PhD candidate in mechanical engineering. Pronouns she, her.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, DeAndre.
Hello, I'm deandre miles-hercules. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a third year PhD student in the Department of Linguistics here at UCSB.
Awesome. All right. So we're just going to hop right in to our presentations. And we're going to start with Jamaal and go the same order we just did with intros. So sorry, Jamaal. Whenever you're ready, you could get started. Do I have to share like presenting abilities to you?
Please, yes.
Okay.
Beautiful. All right. Thank you all for your attention here. My name is Jamaal Muwwakkil, and I'll talk a little bit today as a meta commentary on my research and stuff that I feel might be useful to incoming undergraduates to the UC. So I'm going to talk a bit about the University of California and undergraduate research and broadly the research university as a context. Next slide, please. So in this presentation, I'll talk a little bit about who I am, describe the research university, ask some rhetorical questions that I hope that you will ask yourself and really try to find answers for, such that it can help you to navigate the research context if you find yourself in the UC. And I suggest some things out of my research that I think might make things a bit better. So next slide, please. So that's me. My name is, again, Jamaal Muwwakkil. I am a former transfer student to my undergraduate institution from Los Angeles City College to UCLA. I'm originally from the beautiful city of Compton, which is the best of all the cities. I was a former Mellon Mays undergraduate research fellow, which is a 2-year research program within many different university contexts and similar to another 2-year program called McNair Scholars. I'm currently a PhD candidate at UCSB in linguistics, and also I serve in a governance role as the University of California student regent. Next slide, please. And so we're going to delve into what is the research university and what does it mean for you? What does it mean to be a research university? Next slide. Well, in order to kind of make sense of that, we should make sense of what is California public higher education at all. So it's not an intuitive structure, but there is something called the California Master Plan, which is more or less a general policy-based structuring of how public higher education will work in California. It happened around 1960. But what we've opted to do is to establish 3 separate but interconnected segments of higher education within California. Those segments include the California Community Colleges, which is about 116 different campuses, the California State University System, which is about 23 campuses, and the University of California system, which is about 10 campuses, all with different missions, but working together to form public higher education in the state of California. Next slide, please. So starting off with the California Community College, what is it and what does it cost and what does it offer? So California Community College, we usually talk about it as a 2-year college. It's an associate and certificate granting institution. It boasts the lowest cost of public higher education in the state at about $1,100 a year. That's not including any of the financial aid that you might be able to receive, of which you would be, most folks are eligible, so they can absolutely pay nothing out of pocket or net positive from the aid they receive. So they can be more or less paid to go to school at the community college. Several different campuses, 116 in the state. There's a bunch of them clustered around major metropolitan areas and some that are located in more rural areas. One of the cool things about the community colleges is that they have articulation agreements to the UC and the CSU. What that means is you can take what's considered lower division courses at the community college, and those units will transfer with you when you get over to the CSU or the UC. So you won't have to retake a lot of the same classes and can functionally do your first 2 years at a community college and then transfer to a UC or a CSU, which is a great opportunity and a low cost option to finance your higher education journey. And it's not very highly selective. A good friend of mine, the current student governor on the board, has an interesting turn of phrase. He said, his name is Stephen, and he says, the California community colleges select 100% of the best students who apply. So low barrier to entry, low cost, but you can get high quality college level courses within California at the California Community College. Next slide, please. Now you have the California State University system. I want to be clear, these are not ranked or hierarchically arranged. They're just 3 separate segments that have different missions, which will become clear in a moment. The Cal State University system is moderately low cost at around $6,000, $5,700 a year, again, including financial aid. Very easy for you to net positive if you don't live on campus. If you do live on campus, you'll pay a little bit of something, or you can mitigate that with loans. Moderately many campuses across California, 23 of them, and California is a very large state, so there's lots of different contexts in which these campuses are housed. And there's a lot of degree options, more degree options than found at the community college. A lot of them aligning more so for profession-oriented stuff like social work, like K-12 instruction, like accounting, things like this, where you can think, what is the name of a job? You can be certified to do that job or major in something like that job at the California State University. So great options and very low cost here in California. Next slide, please. Next and finally is the University of California. This has the highest price tag at around $14,500 per year, and it seems like it's going up every year. And that, of course, is the tuition. All the numbers I've cited up to this point are tuition and not cost of attendance. Cost of attendance being your meal plan, your housing, your dining, your transportation, things like this. This is just tuition. Has the fewest locations of any of the segments of public higher education in California, with 9 of those being undergraduate institutions. University of California, San Francisco is just a graduate school, so it has a medical school and things like this. So just graduate level work at UC San Francisco, but the other ones have an undergraduate and a graduate population. Notably, the University of California is research oriented. This is an important point that I'll put a finer point on the next slide. But that's what makes it distinct from the CSU and the CC, is that it is research oriented by mission. It also has great marketing. So the idea is that if you know of a school in California, you know of stuff like UCLA or UC Berkeley, things like this, because there's a lot of money paid to make sure that you know those names. Next slide, please. So to give you a little bit of a clearer sense of what I mean by research institution. I'm going to read this because I think it's really important to making sense of what we do here at the UC and how it's situated. The distinctive mission of the university is to serve society as a center of higher learning, providing long-term societal benefits through and both transmitting advanced knowledge, discovering new knowledge, and functioning as an active working repository of organized knowledge. That obligation more specifically includes undergraduate education, graduate and professional education, research, and other kinds of public service, which are shaped and bounded by the central pervasive mission of discovering and advancing knowledge. So what you might find both in the bold, but also in the resonant lexical items is the idea of research and knowledge, right? So what the University of California is a research institution, which is to say it is chiefly concerned with the creation, the discovery, and the dissemination, as well as the organizing of knowledge. The purview of the creation of new knowledge is the research endeavor. Research is the creation of new knowledge. So that is what we are about. What you don't see here is many words around teaching. It's not to say that we don't teach, we absolutely do teach, but that's not our central focus. So if you were looking for a high impact, high touch teaching within your UC lower division classrooms, that might be a misaligned expectation. But if you were looking for opportunities to engage in undergraduate research and work with some of the folks who are at the top of their field as far as advancing knowledge at any given area, well, this might be a very good place to come. Next slide, please. So some questions for you to consider: what type of model you were looking for, how your experiences might be shaped by the reality of the model and the research opportunities. I'd encourage you to ask yourself these questions as you consider how you'll navigate the UC. Did you know that the UC was a research institution when you applied? And if so, I'm really curious about who told you that, how you came to understand it, and what that means to you. What does it mean to be a research university in your sense? Does it mean just like competitive? Is it prestigious? Is it better than the alternatives? Ask yourself how you take that information. And does the opportunity to do research at the UC influence your choice to come here? Did you come to do research? Is it an added benefit, like icing on the cake? How do you yourself as a student orient to research as a mission in our institution? Answering these questions will kind of help you to decide how to best navigate. Next slide, please. And so such that you were, maybe you decided and you answered those questions, you say, I came here because I wanted to do research. Research was the reason why I came, and that's what I'm gonna do while I'm here. Well, that's great news. You should start asking yourself these types of questions and find answers both in the here and now, but if you don't know, don't be intimidated, seek them out once you arrive. What do you understand your next steps to be in conducting undergraduate research, right? Is that gonna be figuring out what a problem is, figuring out what research is in your discipline, talking to graduate students or your faculty? What does that look like to you? And what do you imagine that to be? Sometimes, just as a declaration, money is attached to undergraduate research. Do you think that would be true for you? Do you imagine that you could make money and net positive through your engagement with undergraduate research? And how might that look? And do you think that money would serve as a good incentive to do undergraduate research? Do you think that maybe credit would be better to kind of incentivize folks to engage in undergraduate research, or we're paying folks? Find out about your network, right? Do your friends that you're engaged with, that people that are coming into the research as freshmen or first year transfer students, do they know about undergraduate research? Are they excited to engage in undergraduate research? Why or why not? And think about what it is that they might see such that it can help to kind of push them more so towards aligning with undergraduate research as a practice while they're in their undergraduate years. The reason why I say that is because the research shows that undergraduates who engage in undergraduate research while at their undergraduate research institution, they're better, right? They have better and stronger relationships with their faculty, better and stronger relationships with their graduate students, have a clearer sense of the discipline in which they're engaged and the content of their courses. So outcomes are good for those undergrads who engage in undergraduate research. So really trying to encourage, if it's not something that you've considered, I'd really love it if you considered that. Next slide, please. And also faculty advisors, right? So that is the answer to the question as it relates to, one of the answers to the question of what are the next steps associated with conducting undergraduate research. It's talking about finding faculty advisors. Sometimes this can look like graduate students as well. Graduate students do research all the time. And every single one of your faculty in your classes here at the UC are researchers. And so you get an opportunity to ask them about what their research is, and if you can assist them with that, a great way to streamline into the research context. But I would also encourage you to consider asking questions around how to choose them and what draws you together. You can have this conversation across your peers as far as folks who are doing undergraduate research. Talk to or the people right above you. Talk to how they talk to them about how they figured out who would be a good fit for them, and maybe you can follow in those footsteps. Next slide, please. Right. So I'll just speed through because I feel like I've been talking so long. I want you to consider how undergraduate research might affect your academics during your undergraduate research time. Do you think that research would make your classes easier or harder, more or less fulfilling? The logic here is, I found that most students think that undergraduate research is like additional work, like extra credit, like you're going above and beyond, and most folks are just trying to keep their head above water. But what you find is, a lot of times when you engage in undergraduate research, it makes the content of the classes a bit more relevant, because you have a central question that you're asking on your own, and you really deploy the curriculum to figure out if you can kind of apply some of the stuff you learn in those classes to your questions. So it does lead to more engagement. And I'd also just say, as a potential model for undergraduate research, community engaged research is possible. So if you have questions about the places that you come from, the people that you grew up around, those are good sites to actively engage as a research site. You can, if you wanted to try to make a difference or try to answer a question that seems to be nagging the communities from which you come, this is a great opportunity to engage those questions and get academic credit for having done so, and sometimes money in your pocket. Next slide, please. So I said all of that to say, again, meta commentary about the reality of the research of the University of California as a research one institution, and really try to give you some baseline foundational information about what it is that we do here at the University of California and some methods by which to engage in undergraduate research. I hope that you take my advice, and maybe you'll work with me as my as a collaborator in the research enterprise in the future. Thank you for your attention, and thank you, Alyssa. You can stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Jamaal. That was awesome. I don't know if you want to stick around for questions, but I have some too if you'd like to answer them.
Sure. Oh, we're doing questions per talk. Yeah, I'm down.
Okay, cool. So per my experience doing research, I kind of stumbled into the world of research, whether that be through going to different talks that were available, say like at the MCC or other resources on campus, or just meeting my TAs in person and seeing that they had things to do after class that were research based. So my question would be, how can students utilize the virtual space to be more intentional now that you shared your presentation about looking for different mentors, or just kind of, I guess, virtually stumbling upon research that they're interested in?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think most people, especially a lot of first generation college students, such that they find themselves engaged in the research enterprise, to do so because they stumbled into it, or they had somebody they ran into somebody who guided them down that path. Really trying to engage in that as well, because I think that it's too, it's not as explicit or overt as we would like for it to be, right? We want research within the UC context to be an opt-out situation as opposed to an opt-in situation, which is to say you get the benefits, the exclusive benefits of coming to a school like this baked in as opposed to opting in. And certain ways that you can do that in the virtual space is there's a lot of talks that are being held right now in the virtual space. A lot of stuff is being recorded and posted and archived. So if you were curious about what folks are doing, you can just if you have a professor that you had in mind, you can Google their name and you'll be surprised about how much you can find about them as far as their research. But there's also some more overt and explicit ways to kind of engage the research frame from a virtual space. One of them is to engage in the FRAP directory. FRAP stands for Faculty Research Assistance Program. So if you Google UCSB FRAP, it'll come up. And what that is it's a directory of faculty who are doing research, and it gives a description of their research project. So you get to decide if that sounds interesting to you. You can reach out to them and say, hey, I like your project. Need some help? How can I be involved? And many of them will be really appreciative to have your assistance, and that'll kind of help to socialize you into the research space. So lots of different ways to get involved.
Awesome, thank you for sharing. So now we will transition to Melanie. If you want to, or did we say DeAndre or Melanie? I totally forgot. We said DeAndre, didn't we?
It's DeAndre.
Okay, I'm so sorry. So DeAndre, here we go. Would you like to share the screen?
Yes.
All righty.
Oh, you ought to make me a co-host.
Yes. There you go.
You can also just enable sharing in the settings.
Oh, I'll do that right now.
All right, here we go. Brilliant presentation, Jamaal. And so I think I'll be a pretty decent follow-up to talk more actively about what my research looks like as kind of an example of the kind of thing that one might get involved in or be interested in should they decide to participate in the kind of research endeavor that the University of California system encourages. And so I'm going to talk to you today about intersectionality and linguistics. Again, my name is deandre miles-hercules. I use they them pronouns, and I'm here in the Department of Linguistics at UCSB. So I'm going to start off by giving you just a bit of an overview of my work as a professional nerd. That's how I consider myself as a PhD student and, aspiring faculty member. So I do research on ratiolinguistics, language, gender, and sexuality. I study, phonetics, the sound systems of language, Black feminist theory. I came to UCSB by way of Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, where I studied linguistics, anthropology, and African American studies. And then on the other side of this slide, I just have a few examples of the kinds of things that I've done. Recently published, so no longer forthcoming, is that first project on the perception of language, or the perception of gender and sexuality in the Routledge Handbook of Gender and Sexuality. It just came out this year. I also, on a personal note, really love anime. And so this project, Asteroid Blues, Reading and Communication in a Postmodern Fiction, was actually based on Cowboy Bebop, if that's familiar to any of you anime fans. But I'm also interested in things like poetry and thinking about methodology. And right now, I'm really working on quantitative modeling of intersectionality in linguistics. And so both of those concepts I'll be talking about more in a more qualitative way, in a more ethnographic way, in a more anthropological way. But one of the things I'm focusing on now is how to translate that into quantitative analyses. And ultimately, my goal as a professional is to become the dope, Black, and gender nonconforming professor that I was always meant to be. So here we go, intersectionality in linguistics. And this is the first kind of definition I'm gonna offer up. There'll be a bunch, so hold on to your hats. Linguistics is the scientific study of language And that's the kind of perspective I'm going to be taking from here on out, the kind of research commentary I'm going to be making in the basis of my analyses. But first, I want to provide an example of the kind of thing that has me invested in the study of language. And so this is a choreo poem by Ntozake Shange that really exemplifies for me why it's important to talk and think about language as social action, as social meaning, as deeply connected to history, power, and all of these other things that so powerfully motivate how we operate our lives.
And there was a dance that was a black dance. That's what it means that black folks could dance. It don't mean we got rhythm. It don't mean the slop or the hully gully or this dance in Houston called the white boy. It don't mean just what we do all the time. It's how we remember what cannot be said. That's why the white folks say it ain't got no form. What was the form of slavery? What was the form of Jim Crow? And how in the hell would they know?
And so this is one of my absolute favorite pieces because Shange reminds me over and over again that history, bodies, dance, all these things are really important when we're thinking about language, which is most typically construed as grammar and sounds, right? But it's so much more than that. And I think that's one of the things I want to hammer in and impress upon anyone watching this, that language is expansive, it's boundless, and it's creative. And that's why I study linguistics. I'm also going to be talking about intersectionality. So this is a buzzword that I'm sure many of you are familiar with and have heard before, and it means lots of different things to lots of different people. And in fact, I have a book chapter that's in press that's about that very particular thing, the ways that intersectionality has been defined and misdefined and so on over the past 30 or so years. And so I want to hone on exactly where its origins are and what that means from my perspective on linguistics. So intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in her 1989 article, Demarginalizing or Mapping the Margins, sorry. And so Kimberly Crenshaw is a critical race theorist. And critical race theory is a kind of group of principles that emerged in the late 1980s at Harvard Law School under the direction of then Professor Derek Bell. Kimberly Crenshaw was one of his students, and she noticed, looking at cases, that one in particular, this case, DeGraff and Reed versus General Motors in 1976, was argued on the basis of whether or not 5 Black women who had been hired between 1964 and 1970, whereby all of them at different points had lost their jobs, whether they had been discriminated against as Black women, specifically on the basis of the intersection of their race and gender. The district court that handled the case ruled in favor of General Motors, arguing that the plaintiffs failed to cite any decisions which have stated that Black women are a special class to be protected from discrimination. The plaintiffs are clearly entitled to a remedy if they have been discriminated against. However, they should not be allowed to combine statutory remedies to create a new super remedy, which would give them relief beyond what the drafters of the relevant statutes intended. This is a direct quote. I can't make this up. What the district court was essentially saying is that in 1964, you had the Civil Rights Act that prevents from discrimination on the basis of race and gender. And so what the court argued was you can't combine them, which seems asinine now, but this is the thing that really sparked Kimberly Crenshaw's thoughts on intersectionality. And I will note as well that while she did come up with the term itself, it's really an idea that's been talked about for at least a century before of Black feminist theory. Scholars like, Audre Lorde, even going back to people like Sojourner Truth, have been talking about the very particular positionality of Black women and what that means in terms of power and oppression and identity and so on. And so it's a way of defining, I'm not going to read this quote at length, but it's a way of defining how interlocking systems of identification come together to affect the experiences of folks who are multiply bound, right? Specifically from a Black feminist and womanist framework. I'm really hammering down on this because in the popular domain, in the public domain, mass media, and sometimes in the academy as well, you see definitions and descriptions of intersectionality that don't attend to this at all, that don't attend to systems of domination, that don't attend to the idea that we need to change them, which is why we have the conceptualization at all. These are things I just want to keep in the forefront of your mind as I transition to talk about what that has to do with language. So language and race is something that's been studied in linguistics for about the past 50 years or so. One of the earliest pieces I have down here is Walt Wolfram's 1969 piece on what he calls Detroit Negro English. Yes, it is that old that it was Detroit Negro English. But as early as then, we've known that race is a social construct that linguistic forms get mapped onto. And one, really good example of this is African American language or African American English, where at different levels of linguistic structure, we have really clearly evident markers of it. So in the phonological sense, which is talking about the sound system, we have things like consonant cluster optimization, also known as G dropping, right? It's the idea that at the end of words, you might say, what's happening, that sort of thing. And then morphosyntactic, which is to say grammar, things like habitual aspect, also known as habitual be, I be at the store, or, embedded copula like he tall, these sorts of things. And then many of these generic or genre-based or discursive elements will be familiar, like the Black preaching tradition or, hip hop as a genre. All of these things map very closely onto the history and culture of African Americans in the United States. And so I do want to make the point that although we're talking about languages being constructed by race in a kind of dialogic fashion, this doesn't mean that, race is just this kind of like abstract thing that just comes down from the ether, right? It does actually have very serious ramifications, although socially constructed, for Black and Brown communities, really everywhere, right? We see it in educational inequality, we see it with housing discrimination, we see it with legal injustice. I mean, minutes ago, maybe not more than an hour ago, the verdict of the Derek Chauvin trial was, handed down, the guilty verdict, right? And so, race and language is, really, really powerful. And there's actually an example of this from the case about a misinterpretation of something that George Floyd said, but I'm not going to belabor that point. So moving over to talk about gender and language, which is the other kind of half of the intersectionality bit, gender as we understand it is performative, right? Which is just to say that, there's nothing inherently, woman or man or anything else about a particular body in the abstract, right? Gender is something we do, it's something we construct, and we absolutely do that throughout language or by using language. And so people have been studying this also for a long time. So Robin Leckoff's really early piece on which he called Language and Woman's Place talks about that. I mean, it's a bit dated, right? But she's talking about the idea that women, which is an idea, right? An ideological thing, that women use more color terms, these sorts of things, stereotypes, really. She was pointing them out, right? Not really reifying them. But then we have other like kind of not necessarily more advanced, but in the trajectory of that work, later theories like what Penny Eckert and Sally McConnell-Janae called communities of practice. Just this idea that, our language use kind of is bounced off and reflected with the people around us who we share some sort of identity with, who we share some sort of common goal, and that we use similar kinds of language to mark ourselves as belonging to some kind of social group, right? And gender is one of those things. And so, again, lots of studies have been done on this. More recently, Professor Lal Zemin at UCSB in the Department of Linguistics has been doing a lot of research on how language and gender is done within trans communities, which is actually, a more recent strain of research that a lot of which doesn't exist on. And so what you will notice is that a lot of the research on language and race doesn't take gender into account. And a lot of research on language and gender doesn't take race into account. On the one hand, you have a really, really old scholarship, right, on language and race that takes as default the speaker of African American English, the typical speaker being male, cisgender, heterosexual, working class, and urban, right? Particularly from East Coast cities, because these are the interlocutors for early researchers. So they became kind of iconic. I think of this as kind of the cool brother trope is what I call it. Think Superfly, Shaft. It's the, hey man, can you dig it? That's like what a lot of researchers had in mind, and it's kind of the stereotype in race and language. On the other hand, thinking about gender and language, white women were the default for a long time. And so really what I'm thinking about in terms of intersectionality is how do we close that gap? There are some really good examples of research that do that. One is Marshall Houston Stanback's dissertation from 1983 at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I said a few minutes ago that Robin Lakoff's piece was called Language in Woman's Place. Marshall Houston Stanback's piece was called Language in Black Women's Place, right? Talking back directly to this piece that was about 10 years or so older. And she looked at the ways in which Black women versus white women used code switching depending on their audience, and found that everyone was doing this kind of audience design using different kinds of features, but they were doing so differently, right? Because their race and gender interacted in different ways. There's a lot of other really, really exceptional work on African-American women's language by scholars like Marcelina Morgan, Denise Troutman, Sandra Lanehart, and you'll see my references at the end, and you can always, go back so you can go look at some of this really great work. I highly encourage it. And so I'm going to provide an example from my thesis of what this research looks like in terms of what Jamaal was talking about, producing new knowledge, which is the goal of a place like the University of California and many other what are called R1 or research intensive universities. So I am contributing to this field of research that I've mapped out on the relationship between intersectionality and linguistics. My thesis was called A Way to Lift Each Other Up, Black Femininities and the Materiality of Discourse. What this was based in a project trying to understand the experiences of Black college students. And so I interviewed, along with other collaborators and colleagues who worked on the project, people who were either past students, these are now bachelor's degree holders or advanced degree holders, and current college students, just talk. What was it like to be a Black student? And for me in particular, I was talking to students who identified as Black and woman or femme, because I was really trying to understand, again, what that intersection looked like for Black students on college campuses. So I'm going to provide an example from that. And this comes from Felicia. Now, Felicia is someone who actually I've known for a long time. We went to high school together, predominantly Black high school in a predominantly Black county on the eastern coast of the United States. Felicia ended up going to a small rural college in the southern part of that same state. It was a very different environment from the one that we went to school in, we grew up in, and so on, right? And so this is kind of her talking about what she found, or where and how she found community on that campus, being a Black woman.
She doesn't work there anymore, but also our associate vice president at the time, Dr. also was some, like, in public, the salutations, the hey girl, how you doing? It's like the energy. But what I appreciated her was that she did that in public. So in the presence of white people. It wasn't that had to happen behind closed doors, but she greeted me in those, I guess, Black ways, or she greeted me like another Black woman would greet me in public. And that's something that for me, that's the reason I was able to connect with her as a person. That's like, I see her across the path. Hey girl, how you doing today? it's always, I like this. I like something. So you have to talk about, if you don't like it, you pick one article of clothing that you like. Oh, I like that scarf. Oh, okay, new hair. Okay, nails. That. Okay, shoes. You know, that. That was like, you know, that's what I love. Because it was so genuine. And it was a way to lift each other up.
I love that clip. This is one of my favorite, bits of conversation from this project. And in fact, a way to lift each other up from this bit is where the title of my thesis came from. But this is really important in a lot of ways, right? So on the one hand, she's talking about this really specific and registered greeting practice that is marked for her as indexing Black femininities, right? It's the lexicon, but it's also prosody, it's falsetto, it's, all sorts of things talking about, physical appearance. And these are all really crucial to thinking about her experience as a Black woman on a predominantly white campus. So this is where intersectionality comes in, right? Because it's not just thinking about the forms themselves, the linguistics forms, right? It's about thinking about these systems of domination and how they interact. She's not just a Black woman talking to another Black woman in public space. She's doing it in the space of a predominantly white institution with a racist history. And she says, and I'll go back really specifically, that it's important that she did it in public, right? That she did so in the presence of white people, right? And so this is why I'm really focused on and interested in as a researcher, the ways that history, the ways that bodies, the ways that culture are all roped into this thing that we do, that we call language, in really important and powerful ways. And so this perspective, an intersectional one, is really, in my position as a researcher, what you need to understand in order to fully understand the experience of a linguistic subject, the experience of, someone who is just speaking, right? And so for linguistics or anyone who's interested in language, this is the kind of research that I think is important and valuable. And it's a very broad field and a very broad discipline. And there's so much other research happening. And so I'd encourage anyone watching, if they are interested in research, to, get involved and follow what seems interesting to you. Thanks for listening, and I will end there.
Thank you so much, DeAndre. So I have a question, if you don't mind me asking. So I was wondering, as a researcher, how you came about this experience of like being very committed to honoring definitions, and keeping that very, steadily remarked on throughout your research. And maybe you can kind of cite who or what brought you to that fact that we need to constantly be in conversation with people who directly named these things in the past.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I draw inspiration from, so many people who I consider, my ancestors, foremothers, and so on in a lot of ways. These are academic scholars who are working today, and there are also people like Toni Morrison, right? Writing a book like Beloved, her, book in, I want to say it was 1987, maybe Beloved, or maybe 83, because, she had read all of this literature. She was a publisher at one of the most infamous, publishing presses or houses in the world. She knew so much literature, and yet she didn't see her experience and the experiences of other Black women reflected, right? And so she's writing in Beloved about what is the experience, what is the life like of this Black woman who was formerly enslaved, not just, right, that she was enslaved and that sucked, right? But who did she love? How did she love? She had children. How did she raise them? What did she eat in the morning, right? These are the kind of things that don't often get recorded in the archive when we're talking about Black women in particular. Other scholars like Saidiya Hartman, like in a piece called Venus in Two Acts, writes that for Black women, the archive is, a name, like in a slave ledger, right? It's a medical treatise on gonorrhea, talking about the ways that the development of modern gynecology happened through the experimentation of white men, particularly a guy named J. Marion Sims, on enslaved Black women, right? But that's a story that doesn't get told. So for me, as a professional nerd who's interested in language, right, it is very important for me that I am inscribing these histories, inscribing these experiences, and forcing them into the archive, and forcing us to have to reckon with them as a discipline, as an academy, and as people who need to see ourselves represented in the things that we see. Yes, that. I think that answers it. I hope so.
Yes, thank you so much. So we will now transition to our final presenter, Melanie. Would you like me to, I wasn't able to go to the settings in the time that you said that, so I am going to just make you co-host if that's okay.
Alrighty. Alrighty, so I guess, give me a second. All right. Oh, so I guess I will talk about my journey, in a sense, to engineering and what I do now and what I'm trying to do going forward. So the title, I don't know if it means anything to anybody right now. So understanding phonons from biological to, or from inorganic to biological systems. And so the gist of my research at the moment is trying to understand how these things we call phonons, which I'll explain later, how we can use them to design special materials and control heat and sound in a specific material to control it. So here's a little bit about me. So I'm a first-generation college student. I'm from Brooklyn, which is a part of the best city in the United States. I have a bachelor's and master's in material science. So I did my bachelor's at MIT and a master's in Switzerland at École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne. And I've always had this interest in biomedical devices. And so when I'm done with a PhD, I would like to go into science policy or work at a research institute, essentially close to academia, but not integrated into a university fully. So how I got started, I remember in undergrad, during my first year, I was a part of a mentoring program, and I was introduced to a professor who worked in a lab, or he ran a lab that dealt with biosensors. And so I worked for about 2.5 years on a project with a graduate student, just developing or helping to develop the material that they wanted to put inside of an implantable biosensor, so that if somebody had an illness such as cancer, where you would need to have multiple invasive surgeries, you could just leave this there and get better resolution in your MRIs. So I did like a really fundamental part of it, and it ended up needing a lot more steps before the idea came to fruition, which I guess is a part of research that we don't often show students. So after I graduated, I went abroad and I worked and I studied again abroad. And I was able to like learn French and German. And I guess a part of the reason why I wanted to learn French was to get more in touch with my Haitian family, and since they speak Creole and French. And so one common interest in a lot of the projects that I did was that they were bio-inspired. For example, I did my bachelor thesis on a way to use bacteria and viruses to template battery electrodes to make them more efficient. So going back to what the title of my presentation was, like understanding phonons. So one of the reasons why I want to do that, or why it would be important to do, is that we can control heat or sound in a specific medium or material. So here are two examples. A thermal switch, which people are developing now, especially with the Department of Energy. For example, we have these smart windows that absorb heat, or they absorb light and convert it to heat during the day. And then when the temperature drops outside, it kind of radiates heat inward so that you can control the temperature of a room without requiring additional heating or cooling. And one other example, which has more of a biological use, would be I guess we can use ultrasound to disrupt a blood clot. So you have this specific frequency that you use for your ultrasonic wave, and you can disperse this blood clot and without having to do like major surgery. And so these are, I guess, broad goals for both energy and biomedical devices. But like one fundamental aspect of both of these are phonons. And so just to kind of illustrate what they are, we call them a vibration or wave in a material. So if we're familiar with electrons, which we can call like a particle or wave of electricity, and like photon would be that for light. This is for sound. And so the image on the right, if you look at the yellow or gold atoms, this is kind of, say, your normal placement of your material. And then the blue shows you what happens when it's displaced because you have a wave traveling through. And so part of my research is to understand part of my research is to understand how different materials, how this displacement changes for different materials, and if we can use that to design things specifically the way we want. Oh, can I pause for a second? Oh,
yeah.
No. There's a mistake in my slide. Hold up.
No worries.
Of how people have been able to control phonons or these waves is this living sculpture. So it's designed so that someone can speak on one end of it. It's about 4 meters long, or 4 meters in diameter since it's round. Someone can speak on one end of it, and then someone on the other end wouldn't be able to hear them. And that's because the way it's designed, the arrangement of these rods are done in such a way that blocks the frequency of sound that we can hear. And so what I want to do is design materials to control this on a much smaller scale to be able to control heat. Or just in general vibrations. So I guess what I would want to do, like the lofty down the road goal for this sort of project would be to understand what this means for cells. So here on the left is just an example of an arrangement of particles. So the idea is that we can study something like this that is easily made, figure out how phonons travel through this material, and what happens if we were to put this material in water, for example, and then use that to look at analogous structures such as this arrangement of vascular endothelial cells. And so with that, we would be able to ideally monitor what changes a cell undergoes, so we can see, like, is it getting stiffer? Is there a heat signature? And just being able to understand biological processes, and later on, if we can use this as a way to sense what's going on in a cell, or with, what's a better way to say this? Or like use it as a sensor, for example, where we know how our material responds in a certain medium, and then you can add a drop of, say, blood, and then you'd be able to tell what's in that blood based on how the signature of your phonon movement changes. So that's kind of like a brief overview of what I do. So if you have any questions, I can answer them now. I don't know if that was too fast.
Oh no, that was awesome. Thank you. Super interesting stuff. I guess I was just wondering, like, why, like, phonons account for heat and sound in particular, like those two things, and if they, like, yeah, why is that?
Okay, so I didn't want to get like into, because some of it also, like, TBH is kind of abstract for me as well. But so you have certain frequencies of vibrations, and so for heat you have much, let me make sure I'm saying the right thing. Yep, so sorry. You have lower frequencies control sound, and then higher frequency vibrations control heat.
Got it. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's really interesting. I was able to,
Or I guess smaller frequency, sorry. Yeah.
Mhm.
Smaller
Control.
frequency would control heat, and then the larger ones would control sound.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So just, yeah.
And then maybe I have one more question actually. So like, what was it like, I guess, going abroad, and as your major, like what were maybe more focuses on, like abroad versus in the US? Like, did they have a particular interest that might be more prevalent, say in France than in America?
So for me, I guess I didn't have a long-term goal when I went abroad, or at least not in the sense of I wanted to do a degree program specifically. So I started off just saying like, oh, if I learn French, then I kind of have I get two birds with one stone, if we still use this analogy or idiom, and that I could communicate with my Haitian family, but also learn a language that I could go to like Senegal or other places with as well. And then it kind of morphed into me enjoying my first experience abroad. And then I decided to go back and like do research, which a lot of it was facilitated by my undergraduate university. So they have a program where when you finish, they will sponsor you or co-sponsor you with a university or a company to work in a country for up to 6 months. And the key for any of them was just that you had to have a certain level of proficiency in the language before you went. And so I started off that way, enjoyed the experience, and then I decided to go back and like do a degree program, and then ended up coming back here to do a PhD because I kind of liked how the US universities operate, in that you are able to do like a bit more interdisciplinary research, and you're not sort of stuck in one concept or one field when you do research.
Got it. Okay, thank you for sharing. So that concludes at least the questions I have, but maybe in the future when this gets shared, people might have questions that I can send to y'all via email. So I'll put my screen back on. Thank you so much for being here, everyone. And if nothing else, yeah, have a great day. And I will see you next time. All right. Thank you. Bye, y'all.